Well, everyone, welcome back to a very exciting episode of the Storybox podcast. My audience knows that I am fascinated and very interested in trauma. And this is a subject that I haven't really touched upon, which is in the realm of trauma, is dealing with inherited family trauma. Now, I haven't really done too much research in that or had very many conversations with people, but today I am going to have a conversation with a man who helps a lot of people understand that it didn't start with you. I mean, that is a powerful statement right there. His name is Mark Wolynn. Now, for those of you that don't know who he is, he's the director of the Family Constellation Institute in San Francisco. Mark is a world leader in the field of inherited family trauma. He's also a best-selling author of the book, which I just mentioned earlier, It Didn't Start With You, which talks about the fact that we pretty much inherited most of our traumas, I believe, and so much more. He provides education and training to trauma therapists, psychologists, psychotherapists, psychiatrists, mental health professionals, coaches, counselors, educators, and he does a lot of different seminars and lectures and teaches. And he was actually doing one here in Sydney, Australia, not that long ago. I believe it was in 2019. We're just mentioning off air, which is pretty cool. I wish I had been there way back then. But Mark, can I welcome you so much to the Storybox podcast today, my friend?
Jay, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
I'm thankful for your time, my friend, and really am grateful because, like I mentioned in the intro, is a part of trauma that I haven't really touched upon, and I am very interested in the subject because I've been through quite a bit of trauma in my own life, and I know my family has. So thank you so much for making the time. Before we dive further into inherited family trauma, what it actually is, and asking you more and more questions about it, my very first question for you is a question that I love asking all my guests at the very start, which is, what does success look like for you?
Oh, boy. Following what you love. You know, it's not about money. It's not about accolades in the world. It's about living a life where you live from your heart, you live from your body voice. You know, that's a term we use in trauma, you know, paying attention to what you feel inside and following your dreams. They live inside us.
Why that specifically for you? When was the moment that you realized that was success? Has it been this gradual thing over the course of your life, or was there more of a catalyst moment somewhere for you?
No, I had to work hard for it. What led me into this work, in the beginning was you'll learn this when you finish my book. I lost my vision in one of my eyes, and I could tell that story because it's kind of interesting.
Please do.
All right. So I talk about trauma. I had symptoms that I couldn't explain. And so this is about 30 years ago, I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. I had no clue what it was. And I go to the doctors and I'm diagnosed with a chronic form of retinopathy for which there's no cure. And, the best they could tell me is, well, we think it's stress. We don't know any more than that. And then the way it was progressing, they told me that I'm likely going to lose the vision in my other eye as well. And, I was pretty freaked out and desperate to find help because there wasn't any. So I went on a search for healing, Jay, where, literally this search led me halfway around the globe to your hemisphere. I ended up in Indonesia, where I learned from, several wise teachers who taught me some fundamental principles about life, about healing, one of which was the importance of healing my relationship with my parents, which had been pretty broken. But before I could heal that relationship, I had to heal what stood in the way. Now, I don't know it at the time, but it's inherited family trauma, what we're going to talk about today. Specifically, the anxiety that I had inherited from my grandparents, all of whom were orphaned in some way. 3 of them lost their mothers when they were babies. And the 4th, she loses her father at age 1. So ultimately, she loses her mother too in the grief. And this anxiety, this was the real cause of my vision loss. So the same as my parents, I had inherited this feeling of being broken from a mother's love because, remember, they lose all their mothers. And this is what was passed down in my family. Now, the way it would affect me is as a child, a young boy, 5, 6 years old, every time my mom would leave the house, I'd be panicked and I'd run into her room and I'd go into her drawers, I'd pull them open and I'd cry into, the 5-year-old boy crying into her scarves and her nightgowns, thinking that I'd never see her again, which would have been true for my grandparents. And all I would have left was her smell. That would be the only thing that, so I'm breathing in her smell. And I remember sharing this with her 40 years later. Mom, when you would leave, I would go into your room and cry into your clothes. And she said she had done the same thing too. And then my sister reading my book said, honey, I did that too when Mom would leave. And, it was the family reaction to all these losses of the mother. And then after healing that broken bond, that broken attachment with my mom, my sight came back, my vision came back. And afterwards I felt, compelled to share some of the principles I learned and ultimately developed a method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
Wow, that is an amazing story. I'm curious about diving further into what actual inherited family trauma is. Where does it officially begin? And what is inherited family trauma for those people that don't know?
It's a good question, yeah. So let's say one of our parents or our grandparents lost their mother or their father, like I just talked about, when they were young, or our mom or dad, maybe they were sent away to boarding school, or they were raised by relatives or a grandmother, or placed in an orphanage. Or maybe, one of their siblings died tragically when they were small, or they grew up in a war-torn country. An event like this can devastate the family. And the reaction to the trauma, this is the important part, it doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. The feelings and the sensations, specifically the stress response, the way our genes express, this passes forward to the children and the grandchildren, affecting them in a similar way, even though they didn't personally experience the trauma.
How does that happen?
Well, see, that's the next important question, huh? So when a trauma happens, it changes us. So literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA, in our body, a molecular change, a chemical change. And this can change how our genes function sometimes for generations. So technically, there's this thing that happens, this trauma. We're little and our brother gets hit by a car, or our mom dies suddenly, with the next baby in childbirth, something. So technically, after this thing happens, there's a chemical tag which attaches to our DNA and tells the cells to use or ignore certain genes, enabling us to deal with this trauma that just happened. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma occurred a generation earlier, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. Let me give you an example. If our grandparents came from a war-torn country, so there's people being shot, bombs going off, uniformed men lining people up in the square, people being taken away. Now, grandparents, they would develop I'm going to call it a skill set. Yeah. Let's say it's sharper reflexes or quicker reaction times, or shrinking back or numbing out, reactions to the violence that they're experiencing. So this is what's passed forward to help their progeny, to help their descendants survive the trauma that they experience. So the problem is, here we are born in the suburbs or in a safe country, and we've inherited a stress response with the dials set to 10, prepared for a catastrophe that never arrives. And we don't make the link. We're not thinking that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression is connected with our parents and our grandparents. We just think we're wired this way, Jay. This is how I am. I've always been this way. And we don't connect it with the generation prior.
How can we identify or really tell whether this is our experiences are based upon what has happened to us in the present moment, or whether or not it has happened to our parents and has been passed on and is attached to our DNA? How do we tell?
That's another good question. So, yeah, we can be born with an anxiety or a depression and never separated from the events of the previous generation. That's true. And we just think this is who we are. But we can also have a sudden onset. For example, we can experience a fear or a symptom that strikes suddenly or unexpectedly when we reach a certain age. For example, we're 30 and all of a sudden lose interest in our relationship without connecting it to our grandmother was widowed at 30 and never married again, or our parents divorced at 30. We don't make these connections. So a certain age can be a sign. Another one, I'm going to call it a certain event or milestone in our lives. For example, a triggering event. We could get married, and without realizing it, now that sets into motion something. In the book, I talk about a woman. She loves her fiance. She thinks I can't wait to get married. This guy's the best. But as soon as she marries him, she begins to feel trapped, and she can't understand it because she loves this guy. But when we looked at her family history, we found out back in, I forget which country, I think either Iraq or Lebanon, both of her grandmothers were married as child brides. One was 9 and one was 12 to these much older men, 30, 40 years older. Now, what was interesting when I looked in her family is both of her sisters experienced the same event, but experienced different reactions to the trauma. One sister married a guy 40 years older, like the grandmothers, and the other sister refused to ever get in a relationship at all, lest she be trapped. So being married could be a trigger. Another trigger is moving to a new place. And then suddenly we become depressed, or, depressed like our ancestors that may have been persecuted or forced out of their homeland or enslaved. Another triggering event could be getting rejected by our partner. So everything's going fine. We've been with this partner. Maybe this partner has only been, we've only been dating this person for 2-3 months, but the grief we're experiencing is devastating. And this leads us back to a deeper grief, an earlier grief, perhaps one that was insurmountable. Maybe a break in the attachment with our mom, where we lost the closest person to us, our mother, because dad was drinking, or she went to university for a month. We were left, or we were in an incubator. There's so many events that can break the attachment, but we may not feel the full effects of it until we have a rejection or an abandonment later on. That becomes the triggering event. Or I'll give you another one more. We go to have a child, and all of a sudden it's as though there's this ancestral alarm clock inside of us. It starts ringing. I once worked with this woman who, she was consumed with anxiety, Jay. She had no idea what was going on. And so we're trying to break it down. When did this anxiety start? And she said, 6-7 months ago. What was going on 6, 7, 8 months ago? She goes, well, that's when I got pregnant. And then I said, so you're pregnant. So let's keep going. What's the worst thing that could happen by being pregnant or having a child, which is one of the questions I ask in my book. And she said, well, I could harm my baby. And then I said, well, did you ever harm a baby? And she said, no. And I said, did anyone in your family ever accidentally harm a baby? And she was about to say no. And she said, oh, wait a minute. And she begins to tell the story of her grandmother, who was a young woman with a brand new baby, who lights a candle. It catches the curtains on fire, catches the house on fire. The baby's upstairs on the second floor. The stairs are inflamed. She can't get up the stairs. The baby dies in the fire. And then the client says to me, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And in that moment, which is common, this is what happens, and often why traumas repeat. And in that moment, she made the link that she had inherited her grandmother's terror. And then after that, we could break the pattern.
Does this happen Well, does the inherited family trauma mainly get passed down from your mother, or is it also your father and grandfather, or is it all grandparents combined? And if so, is it mainly because we spend the majority of our time in our mother's womb, so we're developing in there, and our DNA is changing over time. So obviously, it would make sense, right, for the inherited trauma to latch onto our DNA in the womb, compared to the father, right, who only had like a small little contribution.
It's actually stranger than you think. That it's, first of all, let me say this: memories of trauma are imprinted both on our parents and our grandparents, sperm cells and egg cells.
Damn.
And then this information passes forward to us, and as a result, we're born with altered brains. I mean, to put it simply, we're born with an altered brain that's preparing us biologically to cope with a trauma that's similar to the ones that they experience, which means we're born with the stress response, the fight, flight, freeze response. Now, in answer to your question, trauma is an equal opportunity employer. So it's mother, father, grandmother, grandfather. I'll give you an example. One of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics is they traumatize mice in a lab by separating them from their mothers. So they take baby mice, and I'll tell you one study, I talk about this in the book. Researchers prevented the females from nurturing their pups up to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. That was it, 3 hours a day, first 2 weeks of life. And then later in their lives, these babies, these offspring exhibited behaviors to what we would call depression in humans. And the symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice age. And then what was crazier, surprisingly, some of the males, they only did male mice because you can track the sperm imprint easier than the egg imprint. It's less complicated. Some of the males didn't express the behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit these behavioral changes to their female offspring. That would be, Jay, like fathers going off to war and coming back numb from the trauma, and their daughters carrying their father's fight, flight, or freeze response, his shaking, his terror, his shutdown. But it's not just fathers and daughters. As I said, male children and female children are equally impacted by a mother's or a father's trauma. So I'm just going to give you just a couple new studies that I list on my Facebook page. There's a recent Journal of American Medicine Psychiatry that followed mothers who suffered trauma as children and found that their daughters were more likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. And then there's a recent Tufts University study that looked at men who suffered trauma as children and saw that that they could pass their anxiety to their children through their sperm. And this was the first study. The reason I bring it up, because it's so significant, it's the first study to show that human sperm mirrored the same changes, the same non-coding RNA changes that they found in the mice that were traumatized as pups.
I might be getting ahead of myself here, but is it safe to say that if our grandparents and our parents were conscious of this and they did the work to heal themselves of that trauma, is it safe to say that that inherited trauma is pretty much stopped right then and there? It won't be passed on to the future generations?
Very smart. I love that question. Yeah, it is important for us to do our own work, because we can literally, through doing our work, change how our DNA expresses. This is so significant. So I think I'm going to go back into the science for a little bit, Jay, because I think it's so important here. So again, researchers are now able to reverse trauma symptoms in mice. And I keep bringing up mice because mice and humans share a similar genetic makeup. Over 90% of the genes in humans and mice are similar. 80% are identical. So that's why we can look at mice studies and extrapolate and look at human study. Because you can't traumatize humans, at least you shouldn't, or you shouldn't traumatize mice either. But they anyway, that's another story. Hey, But when we expose the mice who've been traumatized to positive experiences, it changes the way their DNA expresses. Technically, it inhibits the enzyme that causes DNA methylation or histone modifications. These are two of the mechanisms that cause transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. So when these mice are placed in a positive environment, a low stress environment, the trauma symptoms reverse, their behaviors improved. And this prevented, this is your question, the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation.
Wow.
Actually, there's interesting research out of Australia just a couple months ago that found that people who recover from PTSD have positive responses such as resilience and post-traumatic growth. And this is pretty exciting news, but I want to get back to humans. So mice aren't the only ones that benefit. It's the way we heal from trauma, both inherited trauma and trauma, early life trauma in our lives. We've got to calm our brain stress response, whether it's been inherited through our parents or grandparents' sperm cells or egg cells, or that trauma happened to us in early life. I could go on and talk about how I believe people heal, if you like.
Let me get on to the healing in just a moment, but I had another question regarding like the inherited trauma. So regarding the extent of the family traumas that we do experience, is one family trauma or one trauma response from an individual, is that going to be worse? So when it gets passed on to, say, their kid, is that child's response going to be therefore worse, or is that really depending on the kind of trauma that person has experienced, or is it just trauma in general that is passed on that gives us these horrible experiences?
It's a very interesting question. So what I see is maybe if the trauma happens in that first generation to the parents and the grandparents, they're often rigidified, shut down, numbed out just to function. So, the grandparents, the father, he comes back from war, maybe he's all tightened or they don't feel the trauma responses are so grave, so intense that they're shut down just to function. And here we are, a generation or two later, expressing the full Monty of this trauma. We're feeling what they couldn't feel. So I'm not saying the stress response is less. What I'm saying is a generation or two down the pike, I've seen that we can be the lightning rod. We can be it's almost like, Mom, I feel everything that you didn't let yourself feel. Dad, I feel everything that you didn't your trauma symptoms, your shutdown keeps you functioning. And here I am, and I'm the one going crazy with all the feelings. So I can't say the trauma response is greater or worse. What I can say is more distance from the trauma, often the more we feel it.
What is the appropriate age to really be diving into and asking, I guess you call them bridging questions, to our family and our grandparents? And here's another interesting question regarding healing and sort of forgiveness as a whole, like forgiving our parents. What if your parent isn't alive? What do you do then?
Yeah, so a lot of the work is done through visualization. Some people's parents are passed away, or they have a rotten relationship with their parents. And so a lot of the work has to be done in our inner images or visualizations. I talk about this in the book a lot, whether we visualize something or actually experience it in, I'm going to call it real life, the same regions of the brain, the same neurons activate. In fact, the brain doesn't know. So the difference, whether we're experiencing something or visualizing something, the same healing will take place. The brain doesn't care. It just wants the healing. So I like your question, because a lot of times people will say to me, look, I have a break in the bond with my mom, and I I can't heal this relationship with her in real life because I get triggered, which is smart, because if you still go home shrinking, tightening, rageful, hateful, not a lot of work's going to get done. So sometimes I suggest, working with a photo of the mother. So I'm using this cup coaster, maybe to tape a photo over the pillow on the left side, the feminine side of the mother, and saying these words before they go to bed. Hey, Mom, hold me at night while I'm sleeping so we can heal this break in the bond that took place between us. Teach me how to trust your love, how to receive it, and how to let it in. And then visualizing that that this would be, how do I say it? Guided by a higher force, I would say. Or you're talking to the part of your mother that you can, maybe her higher self, or some way in which you're able to not feel triggered by this picture, but to really let the healing happen. Mom, if she had received enough from her mom, would be another way to put it. And then to let this healing happen visually in our inner images. I don't know if I answered your question, but I like the direction we went.
Was that is that sort of all part of those bridging questions? I guess I went in a different direction in asking. A
bridging question
isn't there, but is it the same sort of thing? Same sort of way, or is it different?
Well, so a bridging question, the way I use that phrase is, let's say that we've asked one of the questions I ask in my book is, what's your worst fear? Mm-hmm. If the worst thing happened to you, if things went terribly wrong, if things suddenly fell apart, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? And this is before you had kids, because most people, if their parents, would say something terrible will happen to my children. So I like to add, before you had children, a feeling you've had most of your life. And then people will come up with this, what I call trauma language, core language. And an answer to that could be, I'd be abandoned, I'd be rejected, I wouldn't matter, I'd be homeless, I'd be helpless, I'd be powerless. Another direction would be, I'll hurt somebody, I'll let people down, I'll lose everything, I'll go crazy, I won't deserve to live. So there's many different directions that those questions can lead to this answer. Once we get this answer, and I ask people in the book to do this, first of all, I teach them how to be a detective of this trauma language, and then how to locate it in the family history. But the bridging question is, who in your family might have had cause to feel that same way that they'll hurt a child? Who purposely or accidentally hurt a child? Who did something terrible? Who felt they didn't deserve to live? Who was abandoned? Who lost everything? You follow me? So that leads people to start thinking, oh, my grandmother or my aunt, or you see, that's how I use the term, the bridging question.
I'm definitely following you. I'm totally on board with this, this conversation. I wanted to ask you regarding, I guess, the healing methods in just a moment, but is it safe to say that a vast majority of, say, mental health problems like depression, anxiety, and people can't really locate the causes behind why they feel depressed, why they are anxious, and why they suffer with all these other issues? Is it safe to say that really the core behind those has been caused by inherited family trauma, or just is that the root cause? That they just
I wouldn't say that, only because there's so much. I'm known as the inherited trauma guy, right? I write the book and it's a bestseller, and a lot of people reading about inherited trauma. And I spend 80% of the time working with attachment trauma, early trauma that happens in utero or in our first few years of life, where something compromised our safety and security. And now we have a trauma response. But I like your question, because if there's trauma in previous generations, that trauma affects parenting. It affects mothering and fathering. So let's say our mom came from a family where she didn't get a lot of connection with her own mom, or she was one of 12 kids, or she was in the hospital when she was a baby and she didn't trust the care she got from her mom. She can't turn around and give that care to us. So in a sense, yes, it's generational, but where I'm working is with the attachment trauma with us and our mom. Did that make sense?
It does make sense. So what age should we start the healing process?
If you're listening to this podcast, start the healing process. So in answer to your question, what age? Really, such a good question. So this takes me into so many directions. What age? I'll tell you this. I don't take on a client until they're in their 20s or 30s or even 40, because a lot of times they haven't done enough inner work to not be hijacked by the ego and the limbic system. And that's a whole other story. Carl Jung wouldn't take a client till he or she was 40, because for the first part of our life, we're hijacked in a way where our authentic self is masked by career drives, hormonal drives, drives to have children, drives to have a family, drives to be successful, drives to have a career. And all of this, Jay, masks our true self until we have a dark night of the soul, a crisis. So that crisis often happens in 20s, 30s, 40s. And all of a sudden we lose our health, we lose our family, we lose our job, we have an autoimmune disease. And that experience makes us dive deep into our shadow, into the way the ego is trying to drive the strategize to keep us safe. So in answer to your question, I don't take patients till after they're 21. That's first of all. And generally, I like to work with people in their later 30s and 40s because they've already had that dark night of the soul. Yeah. But can children also begin to heal inherited trauma? Yeah, a mom and dad can tell a story. So, I had a mom. She died when I was little. Let's draw a picture and welcome her into the home. Dad can say, yeah, I had this brother. It was very painful for my family. We didn't talk about it, but I'd like to tell you about my brother. He's very important, so that the people in these traumas are welcomed into the family history, into the family lore, into the family, so that the traumas then don't occur because they're rejected, excluded, ignored, not talked about. That's my answer.
So the way you would help a child that hasn't had a crisis would be completely different to
absolutely
say, a 21-year-old. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. People ask me all the time, why do these traumas repeat? Not everybody that experiences trauma in their family, not everybody manifests the effects of inherited family trauma. And I asked myself for a long time, why is this? Why do some people seem to relive the suffering and other people not? What seems to anchor these traumas? What creates these repetitions? And what I found is this, and this is what's important, Jay, the traumas aren't talked about. The healing is incomplete because the grief is too great. The pain is too great. The embarrassment of the suicide, the shame. Grandma was a prostitute and we don't want to talk about her or that sort of thing. So we don't complete the healing. Or the people in our family system, they're rejected. They're not talked about. They're excluded. They're left out. They're cast out. Our father that had the affair on our mother, we don't talk about that. He's a bad guy. But then we just create more trauma in the next generation. So whenever there's not been any resolution, then aspects of these traumas show up in later generations, and unconsciously we'll repeat the pattern or share a similar unhappiness until that trauma finally has a chance to heal. Freud, over 100 years ago, talked about repetition compulsion. Yep. And he was talking about these traumas. They keep repeating and trauma is ultimately looking for its expansion. So it keeps repeating and repeating for a chance to heal, so we can heal the family trauma.
I've always wondered, because I've heard so many stories, and even with my own traumatic experiences, and just how nasty it really is. And I've always wondered, why is trauma so damn nasty? Like, why does it do so much damage to our bodies, our minds, our psychics? It even has a spiritual component that can rip you apart. So why does it, maybe a very difficult question to actually answer.
No, it's actually an easy question. So when the trauma happens, again, we talked about there's this chemical change. And so we're selecting genes to help us survive, but we're also stuck in the trauma response. And the trauma response is, so there's a trauma response has a defense. There's a tightening, a shutting down, a numbing out, a disconnecting, a dissociating. And then because of that, we have these strategies of I'll use the word the ego, but the strategies to help us survive. Be a people pleaser. Don't get too close to people. I'm not saying these are good strategies. These are trauma strategies. So the trauma strategies, don't trust people, please everybody, be a giver, but don't receive. So these strategies keep us mired in the trauma response because we don't know that there's something greater than this 2-year-old, this ego response, this strategy that's running the show. And then when we have one of these great dark nights of the soul, when we realize we're screwed, man, we're down, we're nothing's helping, then we start to get authentic and we start to heal that stress response. We can do it at 10, 20, 19, 25, 30. It doesn't matter what age. The key is to have enough inner focus to look inward at our shadow parts, the ugly parts, the difficult parts, the uncomfortable sensations, the feelings we don't want to feel, the inner loneliness, the terror, the anxiety. So, I guess this is leading me into how we heal. Can I go into how we heal?
Please. Yeah.
Because I think it's, I've given everybody the bad news and I think it's time for the good news. So we've got to have positive experiences, Jay, that change our brain. And then we need to practice every day the new feelings and the new sensations connected with these positive experiences. Because when we do this, we then change our brain that's stuck in these strategies. So we change our brain. We create new neural pathways. We also stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and GABA. We also stimulate the release of feel-good hormones in our body like estrogen and oxytocin. But even the very genes involved in the body's stress response, they begin to change. Like I said earlier, we can change the way our DNA expresses. So what are these positive experiences? They can be, like I teach in the book, experiences of receiving comfort or support even when there is none, or having feelings of compassion for ourselves for what we went through, or even compassion for our mom or dad when they were little for what they went through, instead of hating them, to have a bigger view and say, of course my dad was violent. Look what happened to him when he was little. Or even a practice of gratitude. Every night we think of the things we're grateful for, or a generosity practice where every day we do something kind for somebody, a practice of loving kindness, or practicing mindfulness. Ultimately, anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy in our body, connecting with those feelings of curiosity about why does this feel good? What am I doing that makes my body feel better? Having curiosity, wonder, awe, all these feelings that I mentioned, all these practices, these types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex. And that helps us reframe the stress response so it is a chance to downregulate, a chance to calm down. So the idea is to pull energy away, traction away from the trauma brain, the limbic system, the limbic brain, the amygdala, our overactive amygdala that's become twice its normal size, all beefed up through trauma, and then bring engagement to the forebrain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, to help us integrate what we're experiencing, integrate these new experiences, and then our brains can change. we know from mindfulness studies, and I talk about this in the book, that practicing mindfulness, it actually shrinks the amygdala and thickens the prefrontal cortex.
I know there's a lot of healing strategies, and with people like yourself doing a lot of research and giving a lot of people all this advice, it is extremely helpful. Is it truly possible to fully heal from trauma?
You asked some good questions, my friend. I think that
curiosity.
I think we never quite go all the way, and there's a good and that's so. Let me say it this way: yes, it's possible to heal our trauma response so that we have a lot more well-being in our body. So we notice this great expanses of well-being, and then when something happens, we don't go down as low or stay down for so long. For example, when we begin to heal that trauma response, something can knock us down, but immediately we now have the resource to go into the body and start feeling the positive experience. Let me go back into positive experiences, because basically, to put it in a nutshell, we need to practice being with the uncomfortable sensations in our body. That's the key. Until we can reach what's beneath them, Jay, and those are the life-giving sensations that that are really going on, where there's pulsing of our blood, tingling, our body softening as we breathe more. There's an expanding in our body. We can feel our blood flowing. We can feel waves of energy or waves of warmth, or we can actually, if we tune in, we can feel the sparkling of our particles of energy, or maybe we feel ourselves going in a figure eight inside. This is a very common place that my clients get to when I work with them. They'll feel a swirl of energy, or the energy going up and down, like the old lava lamps of the 1970s, or they'll feel, a circular motion in their body. These are positive sensations, and we need to get to them. So, and then once we get to them, we need to hold the positive sensations for about at least 60 seconds and do that 6 times a day, because that can be enough to change our brain and calm our stress response. Now, the question you asked me, do we ever fully heal? I always think there's a vestige, a little shadow, a little ghost of that trauma response within, which keeps us honest. Yeah. And I think when it happens, Jay, it's like an opportunity to get to these positive sensations. So I really like that question, because it's really letting me take the listener to something happens, we feel terror or anxiety or shut down or numb, and to use that as a doorway, to actually go into the numb or the pain or the tightening as a doorway, and breathe and send our exhale down through it, almost like threading it with our exhale, because every time we breathe, we weave ourselves back together. Mm-hmm. And then getting back to these positive sensations. For me, that's the key to healing. Mm-hmm. Getting through what's uncomfortable, down to what's positive, and then holding what's positive. So when the bad stuff happens, the uncomfortable stuff happens, we know what to do. Oh yeah, that feels like crap. So I'm going to go be with it, and then get down here to where I've learned to resource my body.
What I've noticed is, and it kind of speaks towards what you were talking about a moment ago regarding the ego can be a massive trickster at times. The ego loves being in environments. The ego is so great at deceiving us and making us feel like just going through absolute hell, and making us feel like we're worthless, and it just makes the trauma response even worse for us. I've noticed with all my traumas in the past, and the healing journey that I've been on, which has only been in the last 2 years when I've realized that they existed and had to go on the journey. But I really do believe that regarding fully healing, I think it's a daily process of waking up and then putting into practice, persistent practice, I call it, all those strategies you mentioned. Like for me, it's exercise, it's being out in nature, it's putting these healthy practices in place, creating a kind of a sense of balance in a way that stops the ego from taking control And if it does, it just like reminds you, if that trauma response like breeds its ugly head again, it kind of reminds you of being humble in more ways than one.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. Exactly. Every day, commit to something that makes you feel good. Get it, like you said, getting out in nature, exercising, petting your cat, playing your guitar. Where I have my clients focus is, often I'll have them say, so put your hand here where that place on your chest gets tight, and maybe put your other hand down here where you hold that numbness in your womb or intestines or that lower part of your body, and relax your hamstring muscles so you can feel an opening at your pelvic floor, and all these ways to get back into the body, and then just coast with these inner sensations. Let yourself feel your blood pulsing, or that feeling of releasing or expanding, or that figure eight in your body, and really holding the sensation. I want to say this again, for at least 60 seconds, and then repeating it 6 times a day.
Have you done much research into psychedelics and their role in healing at all?
No, I haven't. And I know a lot of my colleagues are talking about psychedelics and their role in healing. I've not done much research on it.
What's your personal opinion on them? Because I personally wouldn't do it. That's my personal opinion. But
Jay, I'm open. I've not done psychedelics. I just don't know, and I sort of like to keep in talk about the things that I know about. So I'll leave that one for my colleagues to answer.
Of course.
Yeah,
I thought I would ask just out of curiosity.
I just haven't studied it enough to know.
Yeah, that's totally fine for me. Neither have I. So I was just curious there. But this has been a really, really fascinating conversation. Is there any other healing strategies that you want to mention? Some things that you are researching at the moment that is fascinating you, that you want to share, that you haven't put in the book? Anything like that?
Oh man, like 18,000 things because we could talk all day. So yeah, I would just tell people if they haven't read the book, I really love the book. It's a great read. I try to teach. I do teach people how to become detectives of what I call their trauma language, the things that they say. And then that's the first part of the book. That's also where I talk about the science. And then the second part of the book, I lead people through their family tree to draw up their genogram, the traumagram. Yeah. And then in the third part of the book, I give people strategies to calm the brain, because really it's about calming that limbic system, down regulating that limbic brain.
Well,
yeah.
I can't wait to finish the book. And when it does arrive, I'll dive into it. I've got so many books regarding trauma. And I think I want to add this one definitely to my ever-growing collection, because I honestly believe that you cannot not talk about this enough, because it affects every single person, some to a different extent and different level, and you can never not have as many strategies at your beck and call to heal from it. And I love how you're mentioning the trauma language, because it is different for people. I do know that. Their triggers, all those sorts of things, which we could dive further into, but I want to be respectful of your time, my friend. 2 quick final questions, if you're okay with that. This is another one of my favorite questions, but what do you love the most about yourself and your story?
Oh boy. Yeah, I think it goes back to everything that we're talking about. As a young man, I lived a very traumatized life. I was strewn with anxiety. I mean, just anxious and depressed, and I didn't know how I would get out of it. And I think doing the work, opening up those places that were uncomfortable, and being able to live in now at this age, having peace. And sometimes I wake up and go, my goodness, I've been feeling well-being for hours. And, just these feelings of happiness that I didn't know as a young man. Happiness, I would just say well-being is probably a word. Just feeling this mass of being overtaken with this joy of being alive, of looking at that mountain outside my window, or I would say I'm most thrilled about that I made it. I made it from misery to a place of contentment. So what was the second part of that question?
Love about yourself and love about your story.
There it is. I think I answered both.
You did. Well done. Thank you for that. I think your story about how when you healed the relationship between your mother, you got your sight back. I think that's incredible.
Yeah, I didn't expect it. It was sort of, I was living with the idea that, okay, I'm just not going to be able to see, and that's just the way it is. And, I'll just have to make do. But I did the work anyway, right? I did the work anyway. I healed my relationship with my mom. There's a story in the book I tell, but I won't tell it here because it's a funny story about how she goes to hold me and I feel like I'm going to explode. And I also healed a relationship with my dad, a Marine sergeant, a tough guy, a construction worker. And I tell that story in the book too, how I heal with my parents, which I didn't think I could ever do. And I fell back in love with them. And I don't know where I was going. Where was I going? What were we talking about? Getting the sight back. Right, the sight back. So doing this work, and all of a sudden, one day I wake up and I can see, and the only thing I could connect it to, Jay, was I'd done the inner work. And 30 years later, I realized that it was the inner work.
Mm. Well, I for one am so grateful for your research and for sharing it in this book as well, and for sharing it with me today. Like, you just allowing my curiosity to run wild, even though I haven't finished the book.
I loved our talk. Your questions were really smart, and it took us into really good places.
Thank you so much for helping me out with all the answers too. But my final question for you, my friend, this is my all-time favorite question. I love asking all my guests at the very end of my conversations. It's a hypothetical one, but I want you to imagine with me for a moment that you've been able to reach the age of 100. All your friends and your family have decided to put together a film for you of everything you've ever said and everything you've ever done. Don't ask me how in the world they got it all. We'll call it magic for sake of argument. But they've been able to get it and show it to you on your 100th birthday. What do you want that film to say and to show about your life?
Oh boy, I think I'm so boring that it's the same answer.
It's okay. You're allowed.
Yeah. I think it's really, I think I answered the question, the success question in the beginning, and these three questions all the same way. It's that, when we take that time to be willing to be with what's terrifying, what's intolerable, what's completely uncomfortable, because many of us are so anxious and terrified. And once we make contact with that feeling inside, we immediately go to TikTok, or we start an addiction, or we drink, or we text somebody on the phone, or we binge watch a zillion movies, because we can't stay inside to be with these intolerable sensations. So what I would say is, the greatest success in my life is exactly what I've been talking about through all these questions, which is having gone from completely traumatized from all the orphan grandparents and the mothering and fathering that didn't connect, and the anxiety I had for the first part of my life, and then the physical symptoms, to be where I am now at 64, which might as well be 100, to be 64 and to look back and say, gosh, I have so many expanses of well-being that last a long time, even in the midst of a pandemic, even in the midst of all the trauma that surrounds me, where I can be a mentor and help other people, which is why I wrote the book in the first place, to help people who had no idea what was wrong with them. They had no idea. They had these unexplained anxieties, these unexplained symptoms. I can tell we're done because my throat's going. These unexplained anxieties, these unexplained symptoms, these unexplained depressions, So I wrote the book and said, okay, you've got stuff that's unexplained. Dig in here. And in the book, you'll see I go half toward attachment and half toward inherited trauma, because I want people to see that they can find their trauma, find themselves, and then do the work to help them have peace, because that's what it's about, to have peace.
That's it. Can I just say you don't look like you're 64? For those people that video, you look like you're in your 40s.
No, thank you.
So, but anyway, Mark, thank you so
much.
That's
wait. So that's what it is, right? So when you get peace, you look younger. So,
exactly. Longevity. when you work really, really hard at healing from your traumas. But Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I'll make sure everyone knows where to connect with you online, get your book. All those things will be in the show notes below. But thank you so much for joining me.
Also, I have a training too.
The training, yes, please.
Yeah, no, it's important because I have a training for clinicians who want to bring this work into their own work. It's streamable. I just completed it last year. In fact, it includes some classes from Australia. Last year, online, I did a few classes in Australia, and I included them when there was an online conference. But it's for whether you just want to do a personal deep dive with me, or you're a clinician and you want to teach, learn how to do this work with your clients, or you're a coach. That training's great.
That's all on your website too?
All on the website, yeah.
Amazing. I'll make sure everyone knows where to find that. But Mark, thank you once again for joining me today on the Storybox podcast.
Thank you, Jay. I enjoyed it. We had fun.